With Christmas fast approaching, St. Nick is preparing himself for another December run, both in the NFL and to your chimneys. George and Eric here with heading into Week 16 NFL Power Rankings. A lot has changed since just about 5 weeks ago, particularly with the closeness of some of the good teams as well as a few from the bottom slowly matriculating their way to the top. We'll start with 32 through 21. The Cardinals, the Raiders, the Jets, the Bills. They're bad. There are a few teams here that aren't quite as bad. Who would you take to move up as we approach the end?
Yeah, I like what San Francisco is doing with Nick Mullins. He, obviously is stepping into some big shoes. But they've won the last 2 games at home this year. Their offense is kind of, basically they put up more passing yards against the Seahawks than any team in the history of the NFL this year. I like them. I think they're coached well by Kyle Shanahan, and the plucky team to watch right now.
I've heard some talk about trading away Jimmy Jesus. Of course, we remember the last person that wanted to do that only got 30 pieces of silver in return, did not work out so well for him. So hopefully John Lynch does not make that same mistake. I have a bold statement here for all of these teams. They're all really bad. Let's move on to 20 through 11. And here we get some teams who at the beginning of the season, I'm looking at the Browns, were down in the depths. A quarterback that's capable, taking away a coach that proved to perhaps not be so capable, and now they're sitting in 19th. Can they actually make a run into the top half?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they're a team that they proved on Saturday night that they can win without Baker Mayfield playing well. We saw him make some turnover-worthy throws. We just saw him not really that accurate. And the defense, rose to the occasion against, albeit a Denver team that's not particularly good. So I do see them. They have a decent shot of finishing the season with a winning record.
And a shot still at making the playoffs. That Week 17 game against Baltimore, if things break right for them, could be a pretty meaningful game. As I move to this top half of this list, there's some interesting things here. The Colts and the Cowboys just played each other, and the Colts whooped them pretty darn good.
Yep.
At home, obviously. The Cowboys do have a nice body of work, though, and it's nice to see that one game will not completely change things. We have the Cowboys ever so slightly ahead of the Colts. And honestly, if they were playing on a neutral field tomorrow, say for the Super Bowl, I'm not quite so sure that the rest of the market would feel this way. But what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be careful of just overreacting to one particular game. We saw Indianapolis just 2 weeks ago lose 6-0 on the road to a Jacksonville team that just was beaten at home by Josh Johnson and the Washington Redskins. So you just have to be careful. The line for that game with Indianapolis and Dallas was -3, implying that they're about an equal team on a neutral field. Obviously, in our minds, they've come together in our ranking system, but certainly not enough to sort of have them leapfrog. I think take any of those teams, Tennessee, Houston, Dallas, Indianapolis, basically interchangeable in those spots at this point.
Okay, so real quick, which team out of that group ends up at the top after Week 17?
Just speaking out of both sides of my mouth, I think Indianapolis is probably the team that's moving in the right direction there. Obviously, Andrew Luck is top 5 player by our WAR metric. Defensively, I think that they're doing a lot of good things with not so great talent, and they're in a division that's not playing a particularly hard schedule this week. Indianapolis has the New York Giants at home.
And then Tennessee, Week 17, that seems pretty likely to be a win and you're in game for the Colts and Frank Reich. Okay, to the top 10 here. Philly, they have made their way back into the top 10. Good old Nick Foles. Doesn't look at the scoreboard, though maybe he should, because they're actually back to their winning ways. Was pretty not great first 2 weeks of the season. He was decent against the Rams. If I'm going to say one thing about that game, though, it's that this tells me more about the Rams than the Eagles. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that teams, so obviously the Rams missed Cooper Kupp. They're not getting as many teams to bite on their play action as they were in the season. And when we did our quarterback clustering video a couple weeks ago, we noticed that we didn't have Jared Goff in the top cluster. That seems to be coming to fruition here. We talked about his penchant for throwing negatively graded passes. He was 5 percentage points higher than the guys like Mahomes, like the guys like Breeze. We've seen that happen the last few weeks. And especially if you think about it, the Eagles defense is playing players who have just come off the practice squad, who are street free agents this year. So a particularly damning effort for the Rams against a team like the Eagles.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say that the top tier is still 4 teams. We'll get to them in a second. So if I go from 5 down, which of those teams would you take right now to be the most dangerous heading into the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, my intuition says New England, but I think if you look at all the stuff that's kind of trending in different directions, Pittsburgh's a team that I think you have to look at, and you look at their 3-game losing streak. They probably should have beat Denver. They beat Denver everywhere but on the scoreboard. The Chargers, they got a couple bad breaks with that touchdown to Keenan Allen and that false start penalty that wasn't called, and they played poorly against Oakland when Big Ben was hurt. Throw those out the window, right? You're talking about a team, that's got a pretty good record, and Big Ben, I think, playing better now. He was playing poorly at the beginning of the season, so you give me a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback with an improving defense, all the time.
Yeah, there's two teams in there that have a particularly good defense that many people want to jump on the bandwagon of, the Ravens and the Bears, but their quarterbacks are just not nearly at the level of a Russell Wilson, of a Tom Brady certainly, and Ben Roethlisberger as he's playing recently. So I think those are the teams with the better quarterback that would be particularly dangerous, although we've seen, defenses can get hot, but they can get cold as well, and that's something to worry about. Okay, the top 4. Agree or disagree? 5 weeks ago, we said there was a clear demarcation, the top 4, the top 3, well above the rest. Now it seems like anyone can beat anyone. We've got Kansas City. They lost, of course, to the Chargers at home. They play the Seahawks this week. We've got another big matchup with the Saints facing the Steelers this week, so a lot could change.
Yep.
Do you agree that everything is kind of clumped together now?
Yeah, and the Rams, basically have a pretty easy schedule moving forward here with that NFC West that isn't quite as good as what people thought. So, absolutely, the Chiefs could very well lose what used to be an AFC West battle here with the Seahawks on the road. Seahawks have to play for something after losing to San Francisco. The 5th seed isn't quite as sewn up as people will make it out to be. The Chargers have a tough game themselves, at home against the Baltimore team that we just talked about has really sort of like reinvented themselves the last month and a half or so of the season. And New Orleans has not looked particularly good the last few weeks, losing to Dallas 13-10, having to come back from behind against Tampa Bay, and then winning last night's game by only 3 points. So I think this could shuffle. I do think that there is probably, this cluster of teams is like the elite group, but I don't think admission into this group is particularly as hard as it was a month ago. And, relegation from the group probably a little bit easier than it was, 5-6 weeks ago.
Okay, we've done this every time. End of the year, who's number 1?
I still think it's New Orleans. I think every single year you have a team that is 12-2 like New Orleans is, but it looks poor. And like the Eagles a season ago, we want to fade them because of recency bias, but we can't ignore what they've done the entire season. We can't ignore the fact that home field advantage matters a ton in the playoffs, that having a bye matters a ton in the playoffs. And while a lot of those things will be bestowed upon Kansas City if they take care of business, I think New Orleans, it's basically a foregone conclusion for them. So I think go with New Orleans right now as sort of the safest bet.
Sneaky one here, the Chargers. They play at home. The Saints have a tough Steelers team in a dome, and the Chiefs go on the road. So watch out for them. We'll, of course, be back next week as we move closer and closer to the NFL playoffs.